If you had told me about a month ago that the children's spelling game Hangman would come to weirdly overtake my every waking thought, and that I'd get legitimately angry at people who broke the rules, then I probably could have believed you. I mean, I have weird obsessions from time to time, and that's exactly what happened. But there's some interesting parts that I have discovered during this month-long Hangman haze that I want to share with you. For example, I have uncovered the people who invented the game, something prior lost to history. I've also discovered how the rules have changed over the 140-year history of the game, and what Hangman says about the culture that invented it. So, join me in this, however long it's going to take, discussion on a game you probably haven't played in over a decade that has some really interesting social and political history. About a year ago, when I was writing an essay on the history of pen and paper games for my archaeology MA, I discovered an entry in an 1889 book entitled Plays and Games for Little Folks, Sports for All Sorts, Fireside Fun and Singing Games by Josephine Pollard under the header The Hanging Game, which described a game pretty much identical to the Hangman we play today. The Hanging Game. One thinks of a proverb or quotation and makes short dashes on a piece of paper in place of the letters, an upright line dividing the words. The opponent guesses a letter, and if it occurs in a sentence, the letter is placed on the dash to which it corresponds. If the letter is not in a sentence, it is hung by making a head on a gallows. Thus all letters incorrectly guessed are hung by a head, body, 2 arms and 2 legs, and the object is to guess the sentence before one is entirely hung. Now this was actually quite the surprising discovery, for up until that point, my research, and indeed everyone's research, had suggested that Hangman wasn't as old as this. Indeed, the only book to have been published that has any kind of discussion on the history of Hangman, a book cited by Wikipedia and other online sources, encyclopedias, is Tony Aguade's 2003 edition of the Oxford Guide to Word Games. And in this book, Aguade states that Hangman is anticipated, that is, preceded, by a game described as Birds, Beasts and Fishes in Alice Bertha Gomes' Traditional Games of 1894. Ergo, according to Aguade, Hangman surely dates from after 1894 and obviously after 1889. However, in front of me, in black and white, I had the rules to Hangman, and so clearly I had just accidentally stumbled across something that rewrites the known history of Hangman, which was pretty cool. And what I was going to do with that was simply put it in my essay and then edit the Wikipedia page to say something along the lines of Hangman has existed since at least 1889. However, I never actually got around to making the edits to the Wikipedia page. By the time I finished my essay, I had other deadlines and Hangman slipped from my conscious thoughts for about a year. That was until about a month ago, where for some reason Hangman flooded back into the forefront of my mind, and I decided I was going to make the edits to that Wikipedia page that I had said I was going to do about a year ago. But I've since graduated from my MA, and I work a not very fun job in retail, so I thought, I've got time, why don't I do what no one else before me has bothered to do, and look in detail at the history of Hangman. Heck, maybe I can even find the people who invented the game. So, full of bravado, I set out to do what nobody else had done before, and create the most detailed history of Hangman that's out there. And to do this, I was going to delve into the 21st century Library of Alexandria to begin my research. That is, the Internet Archive. And on the Internet Archive, there is a whole host of Victorian and early 20th century game books, or parlour guides for parties. Indeed, this was a very popular genre of game with countless examples. But one game auspiciously missing from the majority of these published game books was Hangman. It was nowhere near clearly as popular as other games such as My Lady's Toilet, real game, Blind Man's Bluff, Blind Postman, even Consequences, Musical Chairs, Simon Says or Tag all existed in, if not all, at least the majority of the game books. But Hangman, well, between 1840 and 1922, out of all the game books published, if we exclude second editions or reprints, Hangman existed in only 7 of them. Of these, 2 were published in 1889, 1 in 1890, one in 1900, one in 1903, one in 1904, and the last in 1905. Now, we've already touched upon one of these 1889 publications, Josephine Pollard's Plays and Games. However, the other publication from 1889, well, that held the secrets to the history of Hangman. This book was Lucretta Peabody Hale's 1889 volume, Faggots for the Fireside, a collection of more than 100 games for entertaining evenings at home and social parties. And on page 39, she describes pretty much the rules for Hangman, with a diagram. But more than that, in the foreword to the book, well, the notes really, is a single sentence that blows the history of Hangman wide open. These papers were originally prepared with the help of a friend for the pages of Good Housekeeping, and are now republished with many changes and additions. And with that, we have a new lead. Unfortunately, Lucretta doesn't say which editions or volumes of Good Housekeeping she wrote for, which ones her collections of games are in, or even which of the games in this book are in Good Housekeeping or are the additions made to this book. What's more is between Good Housekeeping being first published in 1885 and Lucretta's 1889 book, there's over 100 editions of Good Housekeeping to go through. So, armed with a cup of tea, I had a game plan, and I decided that I was going to, one by one, chronologically, go through every edition of Good Housekeeping until I either found this hanging game or I reached 1890, at which point I could conclude that this game was not in Good Housekeeping, but she first put it in her book. But amazingly, it would only take me to my 17th edition to discover the hanging game. Here in print, in an edition of Good Housekeeping published on the 26th of December 1885, we had in black and white the rules to Hangman, and this became, and still is, the earliest published rules to Hangman I can find anywhere, or indeed anyone has found. To be honest, I'm the only one looking, but still, the earliest rules that anyone has found. And if this is groundbreaking, the next part, well, the first part of that article in which Hangman was published is truly monumental for the history of Hangman. For at the beginning of this paper, Lucretta Peabody Hale and Miss Margaret E. Wright, who she wrote it with, state that it is possible some one or more of these games may have been heard before, and may or may not be pronounced entirely new. But, besides this, we shall give some new games, not only never presented in print, but invented for this occasion. And look, I have found absolutely no evidence for Hangman before 1885, and I have spent a lot of time looking. And so I think it's not only pretty reasonable, but extremely logical to conclude that as the first printed appearance of Hangman discovered is in an article for Good Housekeeping which says some of the games in it have been invented for this article, well, you're going to have to conclude that Hangman is one of the games invented for this article. In which case, we actually know the inventors of Hangman. We've discovered them. Miss Lucretta Peabody Hale and Mrs. Margaret E. White. Unfortunately, there isn't much written about Margaret E. White, and when I say much written, I mean anything. I can't find anything on her. But the same is not true for Lucretta Peabody Hale, who is an established and well-renowned children's author in her own right. She wrote the Perkin Papers, which, if you're of a certain age, I'm pretty sure you studied at English literature at school. But more than that, she was a member of the highly influential and very famous Hale family of Massachusetts. Just to give you an idea of how influential this family is, well, her great-uncle, Nathan Hale, was a Revolutionary War hero, interestingly enough, hung by the British. Her dad, also called Nathan Hale, is credited with inventing the editorial in newspapers. One of her brothers, Charles Hale, was Assistant Secretary General to the US and was responsible for apprehending one of the assassins, or conspirators I should say, in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln while serving in Cairo. Another one of her brothers, Edward, founded numerous journals still in print today and was a key advocate in the abolitionists movement. And then, just because the family isn't interesting enough, Her nephew, I think, competed in the 1932 art competition at the Summer Olympics. Didn't even know that was a thing, but there we go. And now we can add, I suppose, to the list of illustrious things the Hale family have been involved with, that a member of their family, Lucreta, was part of the duo that invented Hangman. What this does not do, however, is allow us to find out exactly why we are hanging a stick figure effigy. Why is the rules telling us to hang someone as a way of keeping score? I've actually contacted the college that housed the Hale family archives and papers to see if they had any correspondence between Lucreta Peabody and Miss Margaret E. White that might shed some light on this situation. Unfortunately, there are no letters there. So unless somebody can find a letter between the two of them somewhere else, or Ouija boards can be proved to exist, we'll never know for certain. However, we can make some suggestions. It might simply be, as odd as it sounds considering it's about hanging something, that they just thought this would be fun, a high stakes gimmick to put a bit of jeopardy in the game. Indeed, the scant evidence there is to suggest why we're hanging someone suggests this. In 1889, the book I've already mentioned, Faggots for the Fireside, the rules are introduced through a narrative of a fictitious parlour party. And Lucreta Peabody Hale writes in the section of Hangman that there were so many mistakes and so many hangings that the laughter came in for those who did not win. Perhaps it's just because they felt it would be fun, and it should be mentioned that in the original rules for the game, it wasn't a children's game, it was a parlour party for young adults and parents. But there might also be another suggestion as why hanging was the first high-stakes piece of jeopardy that came to mind. As I mentioned, Lucreta Peabody Hale's great-uncle, Nathan Hale, was hung by the British and was a Revolutionary War hero. It's highly likely that she grew up hearing endless stories about her great-uncle, and so when it came time to design a game that had high stakes and was to do with secrets and guessing, Nathan Hale, her spy of a great-uncle who was hung, well, maybe that was all the influence she needed to decide that this would be the gimmick for the game. What we can perhaps answer with more certainty, however, is how they came about in the general rules for Hangman, how they invented the game in the first place. Funnily enough, Tony Aguade might not have been entirely wrong to suggest that Hangman came not from, but at least after, Birds, Beasts and Fishes. He was just wrong to suggest it came after the rule set published in Alice Bertha Gomes' 1894 volume. For in 1874, in a book entitled, and I'm going to have to read the full name here, Endless Mirth and Amusement, a capital and clever collection of mirthful games, parlour pastimes, shadow plays, magic, conjuring, card tricks, chemical surprises, fireworks and forfeits by Gilbert Charles, on page 33 we find an entry entitled The Game of Birds, Beasts and Fishes. The rules, as outlined in this edition, require one player to think of the word for a bird, beast or fish. On a piece of paper, they will then write down the first and last letters of this word with dashes or crosses corresponding for the in-between letters. So in the book's own example, the word selected is hyena, which should have been written as H-A. The next player then, instead of guessing letters, has 3 attempts to guess the entire word. And if they succeed, well, they win that round. And if they don't, they lose the round. Now, if you think that this is reasonably, somewhat, perhaps similar to Hangman, I'd agree with you. It's not hard to see how the ideas of hidden letters and guessing that are core to Hangman could have been influenced by this game. But I don't think this game is a direct ancestor of Hangman or a competing game that Hangman replaced. They exist alongside each other in a lot of later published rulebooks that Hangman is in. I just think it's a core influence. Lucreta Peabody Hale and Miss Margaret E. White, as authors of children's games, would have been familiar with Birds, Beasts and Fishes. And, as I'll explain in later sections, early Hangman was obsessed with proverbs, and another popular genre of word game in this period were games about proverbs. Indeed, there's a game entitled simply The Game of the Proverbs. So it's perhaps not hard to see how some elements of Birds, Beasts and Fishes and elements of Proverbs games were combined by these two authors to create their game Hangman, with a bit of jeopardy thrown in the form of hanging a stick figure. Now that we have discussed the history of Hangman, which is prior forgotten, we've identified the people who almost certainly created the game, how they came about, the rules they did, and even potentially why we're hanging an effigy of a stick figure during the game, it's time to talk about rules and the development of Hangman's rules and the history of those rules. Because, believe it or not, we're playing Hangman wrong. And the way we're playing Hangman makes it a far, far inferior game to how it was invented. So, looking at the rules for how the game was invented, let me talk you through how an original game of Hangman would be played. 1. One player thinks of a short motto, proverb or phrase, not just a single word. They then write this out with dashes instead of letters and vertical lines separating the words. They then draw a set of gallows and as many nooses as there are players. Each player takes it in turn to guess the letter and each have their own hangman to record their wrong guesses, with a total of 6 wrong guesses per player before they are eliminated. Repeated letters have to be guessed individually. So in the proverb, "What about second breakfast?" all 4 A's would have to have their own guess. The winner in this version of Hangman is the player who guesses the proverb, or, if all the players are hung, the player who chose the proverb. And if you're thinking this game does sound a bit better than modern Hangman, specifically the bit where repeated letters require multiple guesses, I would completely agree with you. And if you also think this sounds a little bit like the American TV show Wheel of Fortune, I would agree with you there. And interesting side note, Wheel of Fortune was actually the name of the completely different and unrelated Victorian parlour game that, funnily enough, appears as the entry directly above the hanging game in the 1889 book Plays and Games, which I've talked about before. You know, because of course it is. Now, because this video means I get to declare myself a foremost expert on Hangman's history, and because no one else has bothered to do so, I get to name periods in Hangman's history. That's just something I get to do, and you're going to have to live with it. And I've decided that this period of Hangman's rules, from 1885 to 1904, is known as the classical period, classical Hangman. And the core parts of classical Hangman, things that makes rules classical, are as follows. The fact that what is being guessed is a proverb or a phrase. Most importantly, 2, that repeated letters each require a separate guess. And 3, that the guesser gets exactly 6 wrong guesses. These were all consistent to all published rules of Hangman between 1885 and 1904. Sometimes the rules were published as a 2-player variation, and sometimes as the group game as initially invented by Lucretta Peabody Hale and Mrs. Margaret E. White. And they all, but most importantly, they all had those 3 things in common. Indeed, the only deviation from this was an optional variant for expert players. In the 1890 book, The Young Folks' Cyclopedia of Games and Sports by John Denison Chaplin and Arthur Elmore Botswick, where the arms and legs are suggested to be drawn in pairs, reducing the total number of wrong guesses from 6 to 4. Interestingly, this 1890s rule set is also the first time that strategy for Hangman is suggested by people writing about it. Indeed, they suggest that the guesser may show considerable skill in his guesses by adopting a strategy of first going for vowels and then the letter S. And again, because I get to name things, I'm going to call this the Champlin's Gambit. So if you ever play Hangman again and you start by guessing vowels of the letter S, you're pulling a Champlin's Gambit. Let me know how you get on with it. Classical Hangman has enjoyed a period of uninterrupted success from its invention in 1885 to 1904. It might not be in every game book, but it's in a few, and it's clearly getting played and enjoyed. This all changes, in my opinion, in 1905, with Mary Christiana Hofmann's book, Plays and Games, where she, in it, completely rewrites the rules to Hangman. To say that she kills classical Hangman is an understatement. She kills it, buries it dead, hides the body. No one's going to know it's there. She obliterates everything good about classical Hangman. But before she does that, the first thing she does is actually she renames the game. Up until this point, the game has been called Hanging, the Hanging Game, or Hanging Proverbs. She's the first person to call it Hangman. And look, that's not necessarily a bad change, but trust me, all the others are, and you'll see why I'm quite so incensed. Not that I should care this much about a game I haven't actually played in 15 years, but I do. And I'm blaming Hofmann. Hofmann, bad person, because what she does is she takes some of the core mechanics of the game, everything that makes classical Hangman good, she gets rid of it. Repeated letters requiring multiple guesses? Out the window. Not anymore. Want to choose a proverb as your hidden thing? No, can't do. How about a single word or a short sentence? You think 6 mistakes is a little bit too punishing? Have 16 or 62% of the alphabet you can get wrong before you lose the game. Yeah, why do I care this much? But I do. It ruins Hangman, and I'm not being dramatic when I say it destroyed classical Hangman or obliterated the game, because every published rule set from after 1905 is the Hofmann variation. No more, in no published rules, will you see multiple guesses are required for repeat letters. You will never really see choose a sentence or a proverb as the primary thing a rule says. At best, later rules might have it as a variation, but they primarily go for a hidden word. Hofmann kills Hangman in 1905, and in doing so, after burying classical Hangman so far in the ground that it's forgotten by historians, she has created a period of time I am calling modern Hangman. So, the period I'm calling modern Hangman exists from this 1905 Hofmann variation up into basically the present day. That's why I'm calling it modern Hangman. And the core aspects of modern Hangman are as follows. 1. The rule suggests using only a singular secret word. Using more than one word is, at best, only ever suggested as something to increase difficulty at the end. 2. It is universally a 2-player or 2-team game. And most importantly and distinctively 3, guessing one letter that is repeated multiple times will reveal every instance of that letter in the hidden word. Now, I'm not going to list off every rulebook published in this 100-year period that has the rules for modern Hangman in. There's a lot, but trust me, they're all pretty universal in those rules. What I am going to do, however, is talk about some interesting rules, some interesting minor variations that can still be considered under the broader modern umbrella, starting with this book, Alexander von Rensselaer's, I'm not sure I can pronounce that name, Party Games, where in it he provides actually quite an interesting, in the restricted limitations of modern Hangman, rule set. For after describing a pretty standard version of modern Hangman, on page 111 he introduces us to a variation that he's calling Memory Hangman. And he introduces it with quite some bravado. I mean, to adapt this popular Hangman's game to the abilities of brilliant older persons, a blackboard is done away with, and just a sheet of paper or Bristol board is hung on the wall. You can tell this guy was a snob. But, snobby as he was, he's actually come up with quite a fun little twist on the game of Hangman. For in this version, we have 2 teams as normal, and we've got a team of guessers and the team that chooses the secret word. They both have, on the piece of Bristol board or paper, their own gallows drawn simultaneously. One team, well, the team that's chosen the word, then select a captain who stands up and says, we have chosen a word, it has 8 letters in, for example. But he doesn't write any dashes down. The other team then guess a letter as normal. If they guess wrong, just as normal, they get a line added to their Hangman, but no letter is written down. If they get it right, the captain of the team who chose the secret word announces, yes, the letter A, for example, is the 3rd letter of the word. But they also don't write it down. You have to keep a track in your mind. Memory Hangman. Now, if the captain of the secret word team makes a mistake, says a letter is in the word when it isn't, says a letter is in a word but in the wrong place, they get a mark on their hangman, and each team have 11 mistakes, so 11 wrong guesses or 11 spelling mistakes, I guess, until they lose. Quite an interesting variation, I would say. Another interesting minor variation in the rules for this time is introduced by T.J. Shipley in 1966 in his book Word Games for Play and Power. Now, in his variation of the rules, there is no endpoint to which you get hung. You can make as many mistakes as you like. More detail just keeps getting added to your hangman. The object of the game is instead, when it's your turn to be guessing, to be hung by a lesser margin than you hung your opponent. So, for example, if it takes your opponent 15 mistakes to guess your word and it takes you only 10 mistakes to guess theirs, you're the winner. Also, Shipley's book, again introducing another strategy, a strategy that was kind of mentioned in 1890 by Champlin and Botswick, but is more flushed out here. And that is the quite obvious, but he's one of the first people to write it down. If you're choosing a secret word, choose a secret word that has weird letters in it or weird combinations, such as his examples of larynx or pux, P-Y-X. And again, because this is my video, I'm a foremost expert on hangman history now, apparently, and no one else has bothered to do it. I'm naming this the Shipley Strat. If you think it should be called the Bostwick Game Plan because it's similar to something in 1890, go ahead, do that. But I'm calling it the Shipley Strat because it sounds cooler. I mean, it alliterates. Why wouldn't you want to call it the Shipley Strat? Now, in this period, we also get the two worst rule sets for Hangman ever published. And are they as bad as Hofmann variation? Maybe not, but that's because the Hofmann variation actually affected Hangman long term. These rules are worse as rules, but I guess they didn't catch on. So anyway, they're awful. In fact, when I posted them to Twitter, a lot of my followers agreed with me that these are an ungodly abomination. So let's have a look at these two books here. In A. Schwartz's 1968 book, The Rainy Day Book, and Entertainment for All the Family, published in 1977 by G.D. Brandreich, what you have to do during setup, if you're the person who chose the secret word, is give your opponent two of the letters that are in the word. So, in A. Schwartz's 1968 example, you were required, just like in Birds, Beasts and Fishes, to write down the first and last letters of the secret word. So if you chose the word rubbish, which these rule sets are, you would have to write R blank 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 H. And in Brandreich's 1977 version of this variation, where you give 2 free letters, they're your choice. So the same word rubbish could be written as blank U, blank blank I, blank blank. And it kind of hurts my brain, because no, you can see why that's really bad, right? I mean, maybe I'm just way too deep in the Hangman mind palace of why have I done this to myself that I actually care. Maybe you don't care. But come on, you've got to at least agree that playing Hangman like that is bad, right? Anyway, those are some of the interesting or downright wrong variation of rules in the first part of the modern period. But then in 1978, something interesting happens to Hangman. Now, I should point out that whilst I've been discussing and indeed basing my periods of history on the published rule sets to Hangman, just like today, people were definitely learning and playing and being exposed to the game in ways that didn't require books like this. They were learning from their friends, learning in an ad hoc, oral kind of nature. But I hope you can agree with me that while that was probably happening, indeed most likely happening, and some people were still potentially playing classical Hangman in the modern period or even vice versa, you can understand why, based at least on the written material, I have logically made a division between classical Hangman and modern Hangman. And now 1978, which is I mentioned briefly as a stopping point in the last section, is not such a division. A new form of Hangman does originate around this time, called postmodern Hangman, which I will talk about later. But it doesn't replace modern Hangman, hence why we still play modern Hangman, as modern Hangman had replaced classical Hangman. Instead, the reason that I've chosen 1978 as a breaking point in this video and as a way to split Modern Hangman into two sections of this lecture is because in 1978, for the first time, Hangman goes digital. In this year, Atari published a game called Spelling or Hangman, depending on your area, for their platform, the Atari 2600. Why they called it Spelling in some places and Hangman in others, and why the cover art was either this or this, I don't know for sure, but I imagine it has something to do with copyright. And interestingly enough, and as a side note, Alan Miller, who programmed this game, would go on to be a co-founder of Activision. So, there were some big names in this game that only got, I think, a B as its grade when it was reviewed by a game review company. But either way, this game is very influential in Hangman's history because, as I said, it's the first time the game went digital. But it would not be the only digital release of the game. Atari would release another version in 1980, and Milton Bradley would release a digital version of Hangman in 1981. And they trademarked the name Hangman, it seems. And they also weren't the only ones. In 1984, Status System, which was I don't really know how to describe it, but another company that produced games, released a version of Hangman for home computer and also arcades, which meant we got Hangman arcade cabinets, like this one. And I don't know, maybe I can't put my mind in a 10-year-old in 1984, and they certainly didn't have this in Stranger Things, but imagine going to the arcades with your friends and going, guys, I want to play Hangman on the Hangman arcade. It's probably one of the weirdest arcade machines since Polybius, huh? And so, but the thing is, that didn't actually mark the end of digital Hangman. As unpopular as I'm assuming Hangman Arcade was, Hangman as a digital game still exists today. I mean, if you just Google Hangman, if you're so inclined, you can play against the computer in a myriad of different ways. And there are also other digital releases. In 1995, Milton Bradley, because they're trademark holders of the word apparently, released a portable electronic device, and you can still buy those. If you like digital Hangman for some reason, you can play until your heart's content. And that all began in 1978 with the Atari 2600 release of Spelling/Hangman. And I just think that's a pretty cool moment in Hangman's history that I wanted to mark. But the other reason I've created this new section in the video, and I've split Modern Hangman into two areas, is because, as I mentioned earlier, Modern Hangman wasn't replaced in 1978, but it finally got a challenger. The rules had, besides minor variations that didn't really affect anything major, had remained unchallenged since Hofmann killed classical Hangman in 1905. But around this time, a challenger emerges. Postmodern Hangman, and the core tenet of this challenger was an attempt to do away with the very core of even putting a stick figure on the gallows. Now, depending on your own personal opinions, it can be argued that postmodern Hangman either started in 1973 or 1978. And the reason for this is, as far as I can find anyway, 1973 marks the first time that published rules include a suggestion of perhaps not hanging a stick figure on the gallows. In Hurwitz's 1973 book, Games to Improve Your Child's English, on page 320, are the rules for hanging someone on a gallows in a gamely fashion. That sentence sounded weird, but I guess that's the game Hangman. Alongside a myriad of other ways of doing a similar way of keeping score, such as drawing somebody behind prison bars or even drawing a humbug. This is the first time, then, that Hangman has a challenge in terms of keeping scores by doing something else with a stick figure or a stick bug. But the reason that I personally don't think this counts as the first example of postmodern Hangman is because this book actually doesn't relate the hanging of the stick figure to a game about guessing secret letters and guessing a word. It is in a list of ways of scoring any and every game. Indeed, the first time that scoring the game of Hangman in terms of guessing secret letters and a secret word includes somebody not hanging from a gallows is something I've already mentioned upon. It's that 1978 Atari computer game. For in that game, you're not hanging somebody on a gallows, but rather a monkey is swinging from the branch of a tree. Exactly why Alan Miller did this when he coded the game, I don't know. I mean, personally, considering the game was released with the title spelling in some areas, and that Milton Bradley had the trademark for the game and Hasbro would have it at later periods as well, I personally think that the reason they're hanging not somebody from a gallows, but a monkey swinging from a tree, is for trademark reasons. But perhaps I'm wrong, and maybe Alan Miller felt like, as this 1981 book suggests, that hanging was too gruesome for a children's game. Either way, 1978, for me at least, definitively marks the beginning of postmodern Hangman. And personally, during the whole postmodern Hangman period that this Atari game started, I think the best rules published are from 2009 in a book called The Best Ever Games for Kids, 501 Ways to Have Fun, where on page 174 the rules for Hangman are described, but they're not even entitled, Hangman. It's called Race the Boat. And in this game, instead of drawing lines on a stick figure hanging from a gallows, you're drawing lines to a boat. And the objective of the game is to guess the word or all the letters in the word before the 10 lines needed to construct a boat like this are finished. Interestingly, this book also has a head-to-head variation where you each have a boat and you take turns guessing, and that variation is called Race the Boat. And I just think it's a nice little mechanic and a nice way of updating Hangman to no longer be hanging somebody. Alongside finding hanging as perhaps something a little too gruesome for a children's spelling game, another reason to move the game away from using the effigy of a figure hanging from the gallows as means of scoring has been put forward by several other authors who have, in my opinion, quite reasonably linked the game to the racist lynchings of American history. And look, as silly as this video has been, and as near pointless as doing such a deep dive of a children's spelling game is, this is something that needs to be talked about seriously. And whilst I'll be talking on this tough topic, I'm not going to be showing any gruesome images. But if you do need to skip ahead to the next section, that will be in the description below. Because it's undeniable that the noose is a symbol of white supremacy and the terror that groups such as the KKK and Confederate sympathisers enacted upon an entire demographic of American people during the period that Hangman was being designed and being played. It's no wonder that one author has called the game Hangman, the children's game about lynching. As to whether or not I think the game was designed as intentionally racist, well, that is something that I can try and answer. For we now know who the designers of the game was and when they invented the game. And as white as I am, and as much as you should listen to people of colour who talk about racism way more than me, as somebody who knows quite a lot about the history of Hangman now, I think my opinion might still be at least worth sharing. And my opinion is that Hangman probably wasn't designed to be explicitly racist. I don't think Lucretta Peabody Hale and Miss Margaret E. White, who had family connections to abolitionist movements, made this game to be a mock lynching. But that doesn't mean I don't think the game highlights racism of the period or later periods. I think it talks more about the dark banality of racism and race relations in America during this period and the subsequent decades. The period in which Hangman was invented, indeed the decade of Hangman's invention, 1885, was one of the deadliest decades on record for American racist lynchings. These peaked in 1892. I believe Lucretta Peabody Hale and Miss Margaret E. White didn't think for a second that their game would be thought of in the same light as racist lynchings. I think these rich white women writing a game for rich white families were so far removed, socially and even to an extent geographically in Massachusetts, from racist lynchings that it didn't cross their mind drawing a hanging figure in this period could be related to the actual hanging of black people by racist mobs. I believe that they thought this game had a fun gimmick, perhaps even influenced by her great uncle Nathan Hale. But it doesn't matter what they might have thought. This game does have racist connotations. The noose is a symbol of white supremacy. This game was invented, reproduced and played in a period where being hung from the gallows was a very real possibility for everyday innocent black people and Native Americans and other people of colour. And the other harrowing thing to think about is when game books about Hangman were being published in this period, up until the late 1950s, lynchings were still going on. When this 1947 illustration of the game Hangman was published by Pashko, this happened the same year a racist lynch mob hung 24-year-old black taxi driver Willie Earl. And I think that we should understand that. And again, I'm not saying you're racist if you play Hangman. I'm not saying Hangman is implicitly about white supremacy. But I am saying that you can't talk about Hangman without acknowledging the period of its creation and what that period was like because of racism, and what the invention of a game like this says about white society's thoughts on that racism, or rather lack of thoughts. And so, yeah, perhaps the noose is a bit too gruesome, but more importantly, perhaps the noose is a bit too racist. And it's time to move on. And when we play a game like Hangman, or indeed the game of Hangman, we need to be thinking of other ways of scoring that don't whitewash a brutal and dark period of history that should be studied and not gimmicked. So now that we have looked at pretty much the complete history of Hangman, or at least the most important moments in my opinion, and we've had the needed discussion on some of the problems with hanging a stick figure in a children's game, you're going to have to indulge me now as I come up with a new version of Hangman, new rules, which I'm going to call Neoclassical Hangman, where I'm going to bring the best bits of classical Hangman back while throwing away the darker side of the game. Indeed, I'm not even going to call this game Hangman. I'm going to call it Save the Library. And the reason for that is because I like the idea of having some kind of high stakes in this, and I'm a weird history archaeology internet nerd, and so the gimmick I'm going for is the Library of Alexandria is on fire, don't let it be on fire. So, in my version of the rules, the game will be played as follows. 1. The arsonist chooses a well-known saying, quote, or even a proverb, and writes down as many dashes as there are letters in the saying, spacing the words out. So in our example, the quote is, "You shall not pass," which would be written as, well, that. They will then draw the outline of a library, a box with a dome in the middle, on a piece of paper. This will be how the score is kept. The librarian will then guess a letter. If it is in the saying, the arsonist will write it into the correct space of the saying. So in our example, if the librarian pulled up a Champlin's Gambit and guessed you, the paper would now look like this. Should a letter be guessed that is in the saying multiple times, the arsonist will only write it in one of the spaces it appears, and that is of their choice. So if the next guess was an A, the arsonist could choose to either make the paper look like this or like this. It would require a repeat guess for the repeated letters to be filled in. If the librarian guesses a letter that is not in the saying, or is not repeated in the saying after having correctly guessed it before, a flame is drawn onto the library, and the letter written at the bottom of the paper to signify it has been guessed. 4. This continues until the saying has been guessed. Wrong guesses of the saying in its entirety also incur the penalty of adding a flame. In standard play, there is no limit, although you could play a variation whereupon players agree how many flames can be added before the librarian loses. Instead, after the players switch roles, the aim is to have less flames on your library than that of your opponents. Whoever has the least flames on their library wins the round. And there we go. That's Neoclassical Hangman, which I have now invented as a foremost expert on Hangman. And I think it's pretty good. And as I said, it's not even called Hangman. It's the Library of Alexandria game, or Save the Library, or the Library's Burning, whatever you want to call it. Have fun with it if you play it for whatever reason, let me know. But that takes us to the end of this lecture, where I have talked about the forgotten history of Hangman, identified the inventors, talked about some issues with the game, and made some important suggestions. But I, again, have really only scratched the surface. If you have any questions, I probably know some of them. There's a lot more research I've done that just doesn't fit thematically or time-wise into this video, so perhaps I'll do a Q&A if people are interested. But I just want to say thank you for watching this video and indulging my weird months-long obsession with a children's game. But I guess that's just what happens from time to time. So, thank you very much.